He walked into the woods chasing a rumor, a miracle tree said to heal the broken and the lost. For days he wandered through the cold, starving, trembling, praying for a sign from heaven. But what he found wasn't a glowing tree or a voice from above. It was a faint cry beneath the pine leaves, a newborn German shepherd, abandoned, weak, and barely alive. He thought he was saving that little dog. But maybe it was the dog that saved him. Because sometimes God's miracles don't come as thunder or light. They come as love, loyalty, and second chances. This story will remind you that no soul is ever too lost to be found again. If you believe that faith still changes lives, stay with us till the end. And please, subscribe, comment, and share this story so more hearts can feel the quiet miracles of God. Thank you for being here, and may God bless you and your loved ones. The morning sky over Maple Ridge, Montana, was a pale wash of steel and silver. February's wind swept down from the northern ranges, rattling the naked branches that framed the small town like brittle bones. The air bit with the kind of cold that made every breath visible, curling into the silence like fading ghosts. Maple Ridge wasn't the kind of place where people stayed unless they had to. A handful of stores along Main Street, a few dozen wooden houses scattered between frost-bitten fields. And beyond that, miles of forest rolling west toward the mountains. In one of those weathered homes on the edge of town lived Daniel Brooks, a 42-year-old veteran who carried the war not in his uniform anymore, but in the way his shoulders slumped when he walked. He had a lean, rugged build, the kind shaped by discipline and years of survival, but his face bore the erosion of memory. Deep lines cutting across his brow, a small scar above his right eyebrow, and stubble that never seemed fully shaven. His dark brown eyes, once sharp and commanding, had dulled into a restless haze that rarely met another's gaze for long. The townspeople would nod politely when he passed by the general store, but they whispered after he'd gone. "Quiet fella," they'd say. "Used to be a soldier, you know. Something happened to him over there." Something had, indeed. 3 years earlier, Daniel had watched a convoy he commanded disappear in a flash of light and fire. The sound still haunted his sleep, the explosion, the screaming, and the way silence returned too quickly. Since returning home, the silence had become his prison. He avoided gatherings, avoided mirrors, avoided the sight of anything that reminded him of the war, which, unfortunately, was everything. He lived in a cabin built by his late father, Thomas Brooks, a logger who had spent his life taming trees and wind for lumber. The cabin was sturdy but tired, the front steps creaked, and the chimney smoked unevenly, sending crooked trails into the sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and damp blankets. The only decorations were a few photographs, his parents' wedding, Daniel in uniform beside his old unit, and one of his mother, smiling with that kind of warmth Daniel had long forgotten existed. He had tried to find work, at the sawmill, at the gas station, even helping with snow removal. But people in Maple Ridge didn't know how to talk to a man who sometimes froze mid-conversation when a truck backfired. So the offers stopped coming. His savings dwindled, and his nights filled with tremors, sweat, and the slow ache of loneliness that ate at his chest like rot. Then came the rumor. It started at Miller's Diner, a small place on the corner where truckers and locals nursed their coffee in silence. On one of his rare visits, Daniel sat at the counter beside Sarah Miller, the owner's daughter. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with wheat blonde hair tied into a loose braid and freckles scattered across her nose. Her hands were always busy, pouring coffee, wiping counters, folding napkins, but her blue-gray eyes carried a warmth that softened even the most distant hearts. She was one of the few who still greeted Daniel with a genuine smile. That morning, as she refilled his cup, Sarah mentioned what she'd heard from an old hunter named Earl Watson. Deep in the western woods stood a tree unlike any other, said to possess healing powers. a miracle tree that could cure even the worst illnesses or sorrows. Earl swore he'd seen it once, glowing faintly at dusk like the reflection of the sun caught in amber. Daniel had chuckled dryly at first. "You think a tree can fix people, Sarah?" She'd shrugged, smiling faintly. "Maybe not fix them, but sometimes believing in something helps more than the thing itself." That sentence lingered long after Daniel left the diner. That night, he stared at the frost gathering on his window pane, the faint outline of his reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes. He thought of Sarah's gentle tone, of how his father used to tell him that the forest keeps more secrets than people ever will. And somewhere between exhaustion and desperation, a spark of belief, or perhaps madness, took root. By dawn, he had made his decision. The morning air burned his lungs as he packed a small canvas bag, a hunting knife, a tin canteen, a flashlight, and 2 slices of stale bread wrapped in cloth. He layered his old military jacket over a flannel shirt and tightened the worn boots that had seen more miles than peace. The sky hung heavy with clouds, bruised with the color of ash. The forest to the west loomed like a black sea waiting to swallow him whole. As he locked his cabin door, Daniel paused. The yard was silent, save for the wind brushing through the dry grass. The world seemed indifferent to his departure. Perhaps it always had been. He took one last look at the cabin, the smoke from the chimney thinning into nothingness, and muttered under his breath, "Guess it's just you and me now, old man." He didn't know if he meant his reflection or the ghost of his father. The trail began behind the old sawmill, winding through pine and spruce. The ground was frozen solid, crunching under each step. Daniel's breath came out in white plumes, and soon the town vanished behind him, replaced by the rhythm of wind and creaking branches. Every now and then, he thought he heard whispers, or maybe it was the sound of his own memories clawing for attention. He remembered the faces of his squad, laughing, arguing, alive, and then the split second where everything turned red. He remembered holding his best friend Michael Dunn, 26 and full of wild dreams, as he bled out in Daniel's arms. The memory made his jaw tighten. He whispered, "You'd probably laugh at me for this, Mike, chasing fairy tales in the woods." But the silence gave no answer. Hours passed. The sun barely rose, hanging weakly behind a curtain of gray. By afternoon, snow began to fall, thin flakes dancing slowly before vanishing against his jacket. The forest thickened, shadows growing long. Yet Daniel felt something pulling him deeper. A quiet insistence, a need to find something. Redemption, perhaps, or maybe just an excuse not to return home. By the time he reached the old creek at sunset, his stomach gnawed with hunger, and his fingers had gone numb. He sat on a fallen log, chewing the last bit of bread while staring at the dark water that reflected nothing but void. For the first time in years he prayed, not for salvation, but for an end to the noise inside his mind. The forest answered with silence. Night came quickly, draping itself over the land like a heavy blanket. Daniel lit a small fire under a rocky overhang and stared into the flames until they blurred. The warmth reminded him faintly of Sarah's diner, of coffee, of voices, of a life that had felt almost normal. Then he thought of the rumor again, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that somewhere beyond the ridge, the mythical tree waited for him, ancient, patient, merciful. When he finally lay down on the cold ground, exhaustion pressed his eyelids shut. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was the canopy above, the trees swaying slowly as if breathing. He whispered into the darkness, "If you're real, I'm coming." The forest kept its secrets. The forest had a way of swallowing time. Daniel didn't know how long he had been walking since that first night, but the rhythm of his steps and the whisper of the wind made the world feel endless. Morning came quietly, light filtering through the pines like pale threads of gold that struggled to reach the forest floor. The cold had sharpened. His breath fogged the air as he trudged forward, his boots crunching on frost and dead leaves. By noon, the snow began again, fine, needle-like flakes that melted as they touched his cheeks. The forest here was older, darker, its trees towering like ancient sentinels. Moss crept up their trunks, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and pine sap. Occasionally, a raven's cry broke the stillness, echoing through the woods like the sound of something watching him from afar. Daniel had thought the silence of Maple Ridge was unbearable, but this silence was alive. It pressed against his chest, humming with secrets. He moved cautiously, conserving energy. His food was gone, and now he survived on what he could find: bitter berries, roots, melted snow. He'd been trained to survive worse during his years overseas, but this was different. There were no comrades to watch his back, no radio, no mission. Just himself, his ghosts, and a promise to find something that might not exist. By the third day, his body had begun to betray him. His legs ached, and the calluses on his feet throbbed with each step. He kept his hunting knife in hand, more for reassurance than for defense. Occasionally, he thought he saw shapes between the trees, shadows moving when they shouldn't. Once he turned sharply and glimpsed the pale silhouette of a deer staring back at him, unmoving, eyes wide and glassy. For a moment, Daniel felt peace. But when he blinked, it was gone. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to change. The wind no longer sounded like mere wind. It whispered. Words not quite words, faint and broken, threading through the air like memories half remembered. Daniel stopped several times, listening. Sometimes he thought he heard his name. Other times, laughter, young, bright, gone before he could turn his head. The mind plays tricks when it's hungry, he told himself. But even as he said it, he felt the hair on his arms rise. Near dusk, he stumbled upon a small clearing, its ground soft and dark with fallen pine needles. A stream ran nearby, narrow but clear, winding through the undergrowth like a silver snake. Daniel knelt, cupped his hands, and drank until the cold numbed his tongue. Then he saw it, a crude wooden cross, half buried in the soil near the stream. It was no taller than his knee, its edges rough and uneven. Someone had carved initials into it, L.W. He stood staring at it for a long moment, the sound of running water suddenly distant. Someone had died here. Recently or long ago, he couldn't tell. But there was something about the cross, the loneliness of it, that made his chest tighten. He crouched and brushed the moss away. Whoever L.W. was, they hadn't been forgotten completely. Guess we're both lost out here, he murmured. As he looked up, he noticed something else, a narrow path leading deeper west, half covered by roots and ferns. It looked old, but it was a path nonetheless. He hesitated, then adjusted his backpack and followed it. The light was fading fast, and the world had turned to shades of blue and gray. His breath came in shallow bursts. Every sound, the crunch of snow, the rustle of branches, seemed amplified. That night, he built a fire beneath an ancient spruce, its limbs sheltering him from the worst of the wind. The flames flickered weakly, painting his face in amber light. He leaned back against the trunk, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. As he drifted toward sleep, the whispers came again, soft at first, then clearer. This time it wasn't his name he heard. It was Michael's voice. "Danny, you left us behind." Daniel's eyes flew open. The forest was still, but his pulse hammered in his ears. He looked around, knife in hand, but saw only the firelight dancing across the trees. The voice came again, closer now, low and pained. "Why did you survive?" He stood trembling. "You're not real," he muttered, jaw tightening. "You're dead. You're gone." But the wind answered like a sigh. one that sounded heartbreakingly human. Then silence returned, the kind that presses on the skin, heavy and suffocating. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning his mind was unraveling. Hunger gnawed at him, his lips cracked from cold. He picked at bark, chewed what roots he could find, and kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the war again. His reflection in a puddle startled him. The gaunt, hollow-eyed man staring back barely looked human. By late afternoon, Daniel reached a narrow ridge where the forest opened to a breathtaking view. Rolling valleys blanketed in fog, and beyond them snow-capped peaks gleaming like shards of glass. It should have been beautiful, but Daniel felt nothing but weariness. His body trembled from fatigue. He sank to his knees on the rocky ground, clutching his sides as a coughing fit racked him. His breath came in gasps. That was when the storm came. It arrived without warning, a roar of wind and sleet tearing through the trees. Daniel barely had time to grab his pack before the world turned white. Snow slashed at his face, biting like knives. He staggered through the chaos, searching for shelter, but the forest offered none. Lightning flashed, revealing the twisted silhouettes of trees bending under the gale. He stumbled over a root and fell hard onto the frozen ground, the impact jarring through his ribs. For a long moment he lay there, chest heaving, watching his breath vanish into the storm. Then, somewhere above the wind, he thought he heard singing. Woman's voice, soft, distant, and impossibly gentle, floating through the chaos. He forced himself up, squinting into the white blur, but saw nothing. "Who's there?" he shouted. His voice was lost in the wind. He moved toward the sound, guided more by instinct than reason. The singing grew clearer, haunting, almost sorrowful. It led him down a slope where the trees thinned, revealing a hollow at the base of the ridge. There, through the storm, he saw a faint light flickering, a cabin, small and half buried in snow. He stumbled to the door and knocked weakly. When it opened, a rush of warmth hit him, the smell of smoke, pine resin, and bread. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman, wrapped in a gray shawl. Her face was lined but kind, her eyes a deep hazel that seemed to see right through him. "You'll freeze to death out there," she said, voice steady and calm. Daniel's lips moved soundlessly before he managed, Did you sing?" The woman smiled faintly. "I sing to the forest sometimes. It listens." He wanted to ask more, but his strength failed. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was her hand on his arm, warm and steady, guiding him inside. Outside, the storm raged on. When Daniel awoke, the world was hushed under a thin layer of morning frost. The small cabin creaked softly, its walls built from rough pine logs darkened by time and smoke. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low, leaving behind a faint glow of amber embers. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the memory of the storm returned, the blinding snow, the singing voice, the woman who had opened the door. Across the room, the elderly woman moved quietly, pouring steaming water into a tin cup. In the morning light, she looked almost ethereal. Her name, she told him the night before, was Margaret Holloway, though she said everyone in Maple Ridge used to call her Maggie. She was in her late 60s, slender but strong, with wiry arms that spoke of years chopping wood and tending to herself. Her hair was silver and tied neatly in a low braid, and her skin, though lined, glowed faintly with the warmth of someone at peace with solitude. She lived alone, she said, ever since her husband had died 15 winters ago. Margaret handed him the cup. "You were half frozen when I found you. The forest doesn't forgive carelessness." Daniel took the drink, his hands trembling slightly. "You live here all by yourself?" She smiled faintly, sitting near the fire. "The forest has been my only company for years. It talks if you learn how to listen. He looked around the cabin, simple but filled with life. Herbs hung drying from the rafters. Shelves of glass jars lined the wall, each labeled in neat handwriting: juniper, willow bark, chamomile. On a wooden table sat a small carving of a tree with spreading roots, worn smooth by touch. "You're a healer?" Daniel asked, noticing the carving. "Not in the way you think," she replied softly. "I just understand that sometimes what needs healing isn't the body." Her words struck something inside him. For the first time in years, someone's voice didn't make him flinch. He stayed one more night, resting and regaining strength. When dawn came, he thanked Margaret for saving him. She watched as he shouldered his pack. "You're heading back?" she asked. "I came looking for something," Daniel said, tightening the strap. "But maybe it isn't out here after all." Her eyes followed him to the door. "Or maybe it is," she said. "You just haven't learned to recognize it yet." Outside, the air was sharp and bright. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in white, sunlight glinting off snow like shards of glass. Daniel took one last look at the cabin before heading down the trail. The forest was still, its silence vast, but no longer menacing. He walked for hours, his boots breaking through the crusted snow, his breath steady but heavy with thought. By late afternoon, he reached the ridge where the pines grew thick again. The world seemed caught between winter and thaw. Icicles dripped from the branches, and the wind smelled faintly of earth beneath the melting snow. Daniel paused, leaning on his knee to catch his breath. His ribs still ached, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. That was when he heard it, a sound so faint it barely rose above the sigh of the wind. A whimper, short, trembling, and full of fear. He turned toward the noise, scanning the grove of pines. Another cry came, weaker this time. He followed it through the snow until he reached a hollow where the ground was littered with fallen needles and patches of dead leaves. He crouched low, pushing aside a tangle of branches, and froze. Beneath the pine roots lay a tiny German shepherd puppy, no more than a few days old. Its fur, a mixture of sable and black, was matted with mud. Its small body trembled with each shuddering breath, and its paws scraped weakly at the earth. Its eyes were barely open, glazed with cold and confusion. Nearby, half buried beneath the snow, Daniel noticed a larger shape, another dog, still and stiff. The mother. Daniel swallowed hard. He had seen enough death to recognize it instantly. The snow had preserved her body, but her ribs showed through her fur, and her muzzle was streaked with ice. The puppy whimpered again, pressing against the lifeless body, as if begging for warmth that would never return. Something inside Daniel cracked open. He removed his gloves and reached down, scooping the small creature into his hands. Its body was icy, its heartbeat faint. He could feel it struggling between life and the darkness waiting to swallow it. Without thinking, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped the puppy inside, pressing it close to his chest. "It's all right," he whispered, voice breaking. "You're not alone anymore." He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the snow, listening to the faint rhythm of the tiny heartbeat against his own. For reasons he couldn't name, tears came, quietly at first, then freely. The forest watched in silence. When he finally stood, the puppy was breathing more evenly. He looked at the mother dog one last time and gently brushed snow from her fur. "I'll take care of him," he said softly. "You can rest now." The journey back to town was slow. Daniel moved carefully, cradling the small bundle inside his jacket. He tore strips from his undershirt to wipe the mud from its fur, murmuring to it as he walked. The sun began to dip low, staining the snow orange and pink. The wind softened. By the time the lights of Maple Ridge appeared through the trees, the puppy stirred weakly, pressing its nose against Daniel's chest. He smiled for the first time in months, a real, unguarded smile. "Rex," he said suddenly, "that's your name. Strong, like you." He reached his cabin after nightfall. The fire was long dead, and the air inside bit at his fingers. He set the puppy on a blanket near the stove, then worked to light a new fire. Soon the room glowed with warmth. Again. Rex tried to stand, wobbling on his tiny legs before collapsing in a small heap. Daniel laughed quietly, a sound that startled even him. He fed Rex warm milk mixed with a bit of sugar, using a small tin cup. The puppy licked weakly, then more eagerly, its tail twitching for the first time. Daniel sat back, watching the flicker of the flames dance across the cabin walls. Something in him, something long frozen, began to thaw. That night, as Rex slept curled against his chest, Daniel listened to the wind outside. It still carried whispers, but they no longer frightened him. They sounded softer now, almost approving. He looked toward the window, where snow drifted past the glass, and murmured to himself, "Maybe I didn't find the tree because I wasn't meant to. Maybe this is what I was supposed to find." In the woods beyond Maple Ridge, the pines swayed gently, and if one listened closely, they could almost hear a sigh that sounded like relief. Spring crept slowly into Maple Ridge, thawing the hard frost that had claimed the land for months. The snow melted into rivulets that trickled down the sloped roof of Daniel's cabin, carving tiny paths through the mud and moss. The trees around his home began to bud again, their pale leaves trembling in the sunlight like something shy returning to life. Inside the cabin, life had already begun to bloom, not from the forest, but from a heartbeat and a wagging tail. Rex had grown fast. The once frail puppy was now nearly 6 months old, tall and strong, his coat a sleek blend of sable and black that gleamed under the light. His amber eyes shone with intelligence and a loyalty that seemed almost human. Every morning he would nudge Daniel awake with a wet nose, his tail thumping against the floor like a metronome of joy. There were scratches on the cabin door now, muddy paw prints across the floorboards, and a pair of chewed boots near the hearth. Signs of life Daniel wouldn't have tolerated once, but now couldn't imagine being without. Daniel himself had changed too. His beard had grown thicker, speckled with silver. His face had gained color, no longer pale and hollow. There was a quiet steadiness in his gaze, as if the chaos inside him had found somewhere to rest. Each morning, he stepped outside with Rex trotting beside him, breathing in the scent of damp earth and pine, listening to the birds that had returned to the forest. He had begun tending a small garden behind the cabin, a square of soil fenced with reclaimed wood and wire. Rows of carrots, onions, and beans sprouted from the dark earth, fragile but determined. The work was slow, and his hands were calloused again from labor, but it brought him a peace he hadn't felt since before the war. The act of nurturing life, of planting and watching things grow, became a kind of prayer, one that didn't need words. Some days, Sarah Miller, the woman from the diner, would stop by, bringing supplies from town. She often rode an old blue bicycle along the dirt road that wound past Daniel's property. Her arrival always startled Rex at first. He would bark and circle until Daniel spoke softly to him. Sarah remained the same, tall, fair-skinned, with sun-streaked hair, and that easy warmth that could soften any silence. "I thought you'd have disappeared into the mountains by now," she teased one morning, handing him a brown paper bag filled with flour and dried beans. "Almost did," Daniel replied with a half-smile. "Then I found a reason to come back." Her gaze dropped to Rex, who sat obediently at Daniel's side, tail wagging. "Looks like you've got yourself a guardian." "He guards more than the house," Daniel said quietly, and Sarah caught the weight behind his words. They talked a while longer, about the town, about the spring thaw, about nothing in particular. And when she left, Daniel realized he was smiling, again. Not the forced kind that felt foreign, but something effortless, almost forgotten. Weeks passed in that rhythm, tending soil by day, mending the roof when the rain came, sitting by the fire at night while Rex slept with his head on Daniel's boots. But healing, Daniel learned, wasn't a straight path. Some nights, the dreams still came, flashes of fire and screams, the metallic tang of blood. And every time, Rex seemed to know. The dog would rise quietly, pad over, and rest his head on Daniel's chest until the tremors stopped. Daniel would wake, his breathing ragged, and find those amber eyes staring back at him with wordless understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Daniel took Rex to the clearing near the stream. The water glimmered orange with the last light. Rex splashed joyfully, chasing sticks, barking at his reflection. Daniel sat on a fallen log, watching. He realized how still the world was now. No gunfire, no sirens, just wind and water, and a heartbeat beside him. Across the stream a man appeared, a figure Daniel hadn't seen before. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, but stooped slightly, dressed in a thick plaid jacket and worn jeans. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes were the pale blue of weathered glass. He carried an axe slung over one shoulder. "Didn't mean to scare you," the man said, voice gravelly but kind. "Name's Frank Dawson. Got a cabin about a mile north. Didn't think anyone else lived out this way." Daniel nodded, wary but polite. "Moved in a while back. Used to be my father's place." "Ah, Thomas Brooks's boy, huh? I worked with him years ago at the sawmill. Hell of a man." Frank smiled faintly. "Glad to see someone's keeping the place alive." They talked briefly, mostly about the forest and the changing seasons. Frank had the look of a man who'd spent his life in hard labor. Thick hands, creases deep as riverbeds, a limp in his left leg that he said came from a logging accident 20 years back. Despite his gruff appearance, there was a gentleness in how he spoke, a patience learned from time and solitude. Before leaving, he glanced at Rex and said, "Good dog. German Shepherd, right? They'll give their lives for you if you let them." "I know," Daniel said softly, watching as Rex wagged his tail at the compliment. When Frank disappeared back into the trees, Daniel lingered by the stream, thinking about how easily life had begun to stitch itself together again. Not perfectly, not without scars, but enough to hold. That night, as rain began to fall, he sat by the fire with Rex lying beside him, one paw draped over Daniel's boot. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. He remembered what Margaret had said, that the forest speaks if you know how to listen. And as the rain tapped against the windows, Daniel thought he heard it now. Not whispers of guilt or ghosts, but a kind of quiet music, the rhythm of life continuing. He closed his eyes, feeling Rex's breathing against his leg, and for the first time in years, sleep came easily. The nightmares didn't follow, only the sound of rain and the deep, even heartbeat of a loyal friend. Autumn had come quietly to Maple Ridge, painting the forest in deep shades of gold and copper. The air was crisp but gentle, scented with pine resin and wood smoke from distant cabins. Daniel walked the familiar trail behind his home with Rex trotting beside him, the dog's coat gleaming like burnished bronze in the sunlight. The years had softened the scars on Daniel's mind. There were still nights when old memories stirred, but they no longer ruled him. He had found something close to peace, a rhythm of living that required no explanation. Rex had grown into a magnificent German shepherd, 2 years old now, tall and muscular, with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold a quiet understanding of everything around him. He moved with the calm confidence of a protector who knew his purpose. The townsfolk who once avoided Daniel now greeted him kindly whenever he came into town for supplies. Some even stopped by his cabin for firewood or advice on repairs, and Daniel would help without hesitation. Sarah Miller still visited once a week, often bringing a basket of freshly baked bread or apples from her father's small orchard. Her face had grown a little older, a little softer in the light, but her smile was the same, warm and genuine. Sometimes she and Daniel would sit on the porch as the sun went down, sipping coffee while Rex dozed at their feet. There was no need for many words. Between them was a quiet bond born not of romance, but of mutual understanding. Two people who had learned to live after loss. Frank Dawson, too, remained part of Daniel's slow-growing circle. He'd drop by with lumber or venison and stay for supper, trading stories about the old days at the sawmill. The older man had found comfort in Daniel's company, saying it reminded him of the comradeship he'd lost when the mill shut down years ago. Frank's limp had worsened slightly with age, but he carried it without complaint, still splitting wood as if defying the years. It was on one of those autumn afternoons, after helping Frank mend a fence, that Daniel decided to take Rex deeper into the forest, beyond the paths he usually followed, toward the ridge where the trees grew thicker and older. The light slanted through the canopy in ribbons of gold, and the forest floor was soft with fallen leaves. Rex darted ahead, nose low to the ground, tail swaying. Every now and then, he'd look back to make sure Daniel was following. As they walked, Daniel found himself thinking of the woman who had once saved him in the blizzard, Margaret Holloway. He had never seen her again after that morning he left her cabin. When he'd tried to find the place later, it was gone. No smoke, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. At first, he thought he'd imagined her, another ghost conjured by the forest. But every time the wind whispered through the trees, he could almost hear her voice. The forest listens, Daniel. You just have to know what it's saying. They reached a clearing Daniel didn't remember seeing before. The light here felt different, warmer, almost golden in its stillness. At its center stood an enormous tree. Its trunk was wide enough for 3 men to encircle, the bark weathered and cracked like ancient skin. But what caught Daniel's eye was the faint glow beneath those cracks, a soft amber light that pulsed like a heartbeat. He stopped in his tracks. Rex, sensing the change in his master, went still beside him. The forest around them was utterly silent, as though holding its breath. Daniel took a cautious step forward. The closer he got, the stronger the light seemed, though it wasn't harsh. It shimmered gently, like sunlight filtering through water. He raised a hand and placed it against the trunk. The bark was warm. A sudden rush of memory flooded his mind. Flashes of his past, the convoy explosion, the faces of his men, the endless nights of guilt, the storm, the woman's voice, the day he found Rex under the pines. But this time, the memories didn't hurt. They flowed through him like a river smoothing jagged stones. His knees gave way, and he sank to the ground, staring up at the branches that stretched high into the sky. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Then, a laugh, soft, shaky but genuine, escaped his lips. So, he murmured, you were real all along. Rex tilted his head, letting out a low, curious bark. Daniel reached over, resting a hand on the dog's neck. Maybe I didn't find you back then because I wasn't ready. Maybe you waited until I was. His voice trembled with emotion. You didn't heal me with magic, did you? You healed me by sending him. The tree's branches swayed gently, though there was no wind. A single golden leaf drifted down, landing beside Rex's paw. The dog sniffed it, then looked up, ears pricked, tail wagging once. Daniel smiled through the tears that blurred his vision. He thought of all that had happened since that winter. The fear, the loneliness, the nights spent speaking only to the fire. And then he thought of Rex's first bark, the first time he'd smiled again, the mornings filled with life. It all felt like the slow unfolding of something sacred, a miracle not of divine power, but of grace. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel the need to understand everything. Some things, he realized, were meant simply to be felt. He stood, placing a hand on the dog's back, and looked at the glowing bark one last time. Thank you, he said quietly, for not giving up on me. The light within the trunk pulsed once. brighter, as if in reply. Then it faded slowly until the tree looked ordinary again, ancient but still, the kind of thing one could walk past without ever knowing its secret. Daniel and Rex turned back toward home. The path behind them was strewn with golden leaves that shimmered faintly in the waning light. As they reached the edge of the clearing, a soft wind rose, carrying with it a whisper that sounded like laughter, or perhaps just the sigh of branches shifting against the sky. When they reached the cabin, the last light of day was slipping away. Sarah's bicycle leaned against the porch, and the scent of coffee drifted from the open window. She waved as Daniel approached. "You two disappear for hours every time," she said with a smile. Daniel looked down at Rex, who wagged his tail and trotted up the steps ahead of him. "Just getting lost in the woods," he replied. "But it's a good kind of lost." That night, as the fire crackled and Rex dozed by the hearth, Daniel glanced toward the window. The moonlight touched the trees beyond, and for an instant, he thought he saw a faint glow deep among the branches, soft and golden, like a smile. He whispered, almost to himself, "I found you after all." Outside, the forest exhaled, and the leaves stirred in gentle applause. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive in thunder or lightning. They come quietly, through a warm touch, a loyal companion, or a simple moment that makes your heart feel alive again. Daniel spent years searching for a magical tree that could heal his wounds, but what he found instead was God's miracle written in another form: love. The kind of love that restores broken souls and reminds us that life, no matter how dark it gets, is still sacred. Just like Daniel, we often chase grand signs from heaven, waiting for proof that God hasn't forgotten us. But maybe the proof is already around us, in the eyes of someone who cares, in the wag of a dog's tail, in the sunrise after a long night of fear. Every small act of kindness, every breath of hope, is a whisper from God saying, "You're not alone. I'm still here." So if you're going through pain, loss, or loneliness, take a moment to look closer. The miracle you seek might not be a shining tree in the forest. It might be right beside you, waiting to be noticed. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that faith still works in quiet, beautiful ways. Leave a comment below and tell us, what's the miracle that changed your life? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more hearts can find peace through stories of faith and compassion. May God bless you, protect your home, and plant within you the same seed of healing that He gave to Daniel. May the Lord watch over you, and may you never stop believing in small miracles.